This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Scott Simon, and thank you for joining us. You've just seen a program describing events that occurred during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire during World War I. For the next half hour, we're going to discuss some of the issues that were raised in this documentary, and we're joined by four guests. Justin McCarthy is a professor of history at the University of Louisville. Taner Akçam, who appeared in the program, is a Turkish sociologist and historian. He's currently a visiting professor at the University of Minnesota. Omar Turan is an associate professor of history at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Turkey. And Peter Balakian, who also appeared in the program, is a poet and a memoirist and a professor of the humanities at Colgate University. Gentlemen, thanks all very much for being with us. I want to turn to you first, Professor McCarthy, because I know you have a different viewpoint than some of what we've seen in the film. I have to begin by saying it's impossible not to see this very powerful film. Pictures of the killing fields, the cattle cars, the very vivid descriptions of people who saw firsthand what happened, and not to conclude that what the world saw was an extinction, a genocide of the Armenian people.
Well, I think that proves that the propagandists did their work very well, because this is really propaganda masquerading as history. It is true that the Armenians suffered terribly. The difficulty is, by only presenting half of a story, by only showing you the Armenian dead, they make it appear like a genocide. The Armenians did suffer terribly, but the Muslims, the Turks and the Kurds, they suffered equally as badly. And by skipping that, by not putting that in, they have made what was actually closer to a civil war, or perhaps a mutual genocide, appear like a slaughter of one group by another. This movie, unfortunately, this program, unfortunately, is historically extremely inaccurate. Not simply about Armenians.
Can you point out a couple of specific inaccuracies in your judgment?
Well, take something that has nothing to do with this issue, for instance. They talk about the Balkan Wars, which were fought in 1912, 1913. Yeah. They misidentify the countries. They say that Romania fought against the Ottomans, which it didn't. They imply that Greece and Serbia and Romania and these places didn't exist until then, when they took themselves free of the Ottoman Empire.
What about some inaccuracies as it relates to the
biggest inaccuracy is a crime of omission to me. For instance, they don't mention that the beginning of what's called the Armenian genocide was revolt by Armenians, especially in the province of Van, that began when mobilization took place, even before the war took place, began almost a year before the events of any deportations, and which had attendant upon it a tremendous slaughter of Muslim civilians. Now, this was the first thing that happened. I don't think it's terribly important what happened first, because this is an inhuman time for everyone. But to not mention that what happened to the Armenians happened primarily out of revenge for things that Armenians did is simply to falsify history tremendously. It's like taking the American Civil War and saying it was a genocide of the South because you don't mention that the northern people died as well.
Why don't we, Peter Balakian?
Well, I think what you've heard from Mr. McCarthy is a fantasy. And I think it's important to say that Mr. McCarthy and Mr. Turan have worked for the Turkish government to help that government deny the Armenian genocide. And I think it's important for our viewers to understand that the Turkish government has had an egregious human rights record against intellectuals and intellectual freedom. It has made the Armenian genocide taboo and illegal in its own country. And so be working with that kind of project is already to make it clear what kind of propaganda you're engaged in. What I think this documentary shows so brilliantly is the mainstream international scholarly discourse that is embedded in the Armenian genocide discourse. For the first time, we see terrific Turkish scholars like Taner Akçam, Müge Gocak, Mr. Berktay, Mr. Adenir talk self-critically about their past. What the Turkish government has outlawed is self-critical analysis of its past. And unfortunately, these gentlemen are part of that project, and I think that tells you a great deal. There's no propaganda about the Armenian genocide outside of Turkey. Turkey is where the propaganda is generated, and it's part of a nationalist project. Let me also say what I think is so powerful about this film. We see Raphael Lemkin on national television in 1949, the man who invented the concept of genocide, talking about genocide. using the term Armenian genocide publicly in a very early moment in the morphology of that concept, and that's very powerful because the Armenian case was part of Raphael Lemkin's understanding of what genocide was.
Let me turn to Omar Turan, if I could. What do you make of these very vivid first-hand accounts that of the time that appeared in newspapers, that were sent back to embassies, missionaries, people who saw firsthand what was happening? And the word genocide wasn't commonly used, but they certainly referred to it as a slaughter and a massacre that was deliberately intended to extinguish the Armenian people.
I worked in that missionary archives, and I also worked in the archives of Amiral Bristol, who was the High Commissioner of the United States in Istanbul. And in his reports, Amiral Bristol says that, I know that there is a strong propaganda being carried out in the United States in favor of the Greeks and Armenians, and I have read articles in which I know they contain the greatest inaccuracies, if not untruths. I can give some
was
more...
inaccuracy is the word?
Yeah, I can give some more examples from what Amiral Bristol said about the propaganda work in the United States.
Well, I'm obviously not familiar with that, but it seems to me that to take one out of a morass of first-hand accounts and to have somebody refer to that as some inaccuracies were represented is different from impeaching the first-hand accounts of people who were there and saw what happened. What explanation is there for that?
Those informations, let me call, was sent to the United States from the same sources. In one of other records, Amiral Bristol says that he discussed in one of his interviews with Bishop Darlington, and Bishop Darlington speaks about 2 million deaths of the Armenians, and he says it's written in all Swiss, American, French, British newspapers, and Admiral Bristol says that, well, it's written in all those newspapers, but their sources are the same from one source.
I'm not sure I follow that, but you wouldn't dispute but that there were hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths, would you?
No.
Even if the exact figure.
No, someone claims it, and Admiral Bristol says these claims are coming from the same source.
Well, let me turn to
in all these newspapers.
I mean,
Professor
it is
Akşam.
not a necessary debate.
Yeah.
I'm working on the archives, and I know all the archival materials. Generally, everyone should know that there is no inconsistency between American, German, British, and Ottoman and Austria-Hungary materials. All these archival materials, including the Ottoman materials, gives a very clear picture of the genocidal intent of the Ottoman authorities. To pick up one document and to explain all the events, and so these are not, we are scholars, and we have to be very careful, and we have to avoid making vague, unsupported generalizations. There were German casualties in the Second World War. The number of German deaths was more than killed Jewish people. Muslim casualties in First World War, maybe 1.5 million, 2 million, but it has nothing to do with the 1915 and with the genocidal intent of the Ottoman authorities. What we are discussing here, whether or not Ottoman authority is intently wanted to eliminate a population because they belong to a certain ethnic and religious group. And this is the reality, and this is the beginning of the discussion. This must be why. Because this is the history of Turkey. If you don't know the Turkish history, you will surprise and think that, oh, there are two opinions, there are two different positions, and so on. You know, we discussed in Turkey 30 years whether there are Kurds or not in Turkey.
Whether there are not, whether
yes,
Kurds or not.
we discussed. Because Turkish Republic, if you want to understand, you have to know that this republic, based because of these or other reasons, certain myths, there are legends on which we build our republic. And one of the legends is that there are no Kurds in Turkey. The other legend was